So let's get going. Good afternoon. Welcome to the 5th Annual Presidential Symposium. Presidential, that would be President Seligman, and it's difficult with the lights the way they are to see him, but there he is. And this Presidential Symposium is on restructuring financial regulation. Particularly welcome the panelists, but welcome to you all. My name is Hugo Sonnenschein. I'm a graduate of the University of Rochester, class of '61, and I'm a trustee of the university. The Presidential Symposium is the creation of President Seligman. At the first symposium, which was paired with the installation of our president, the topic was universities. On that occasion, I asked us to keep in mind that universities exist to concentrate on the little questions. How the universe began, how life began, how life passes on from generation to generation, how art reflects our world and defines our humanity, how it changes our lives. How can the peoples of the world live together more peacefully, more productively, and in greater health? And what about energy? And what about the sustainability of our planet? The little questions. We have had superb panels, Nobel laureates, plural. There have been 3 of them. A majority leader of the Senate, advisors to the president, a cabinet member, thought leaders, and most distinguished academics. No panel has been more learned or more distinguished than the panel we have the privilege of joining today. No subject has been more pressing or more in need of answers, wisdom, and careful analysis. It's another little question. How are we to restructure financial regulation going forward? Allow me to set the frame. Approximately 1 year ago, the United States financial system experienced its most serious emergency in the post-World War II period. On September 15, 2008, Lehman Brothers, then the 4th largest investment bank in the country, with more than 25,000 employees, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The day after the Lehman bankruptcy filing, the Department of Treasury orchestrated an $85 billion rescue package for insurance giant AIG. In 6 months, 3 of the 5 largest independent investment banks, Bear Stearns, Lehman, and Merrill Lynch, were gone as independent entities, and within a few days, the remaining 2, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, had converted from investment banks to commercial bank holding companies. On October 3, 2008, Congress enacted the $700 billion Emergency Economic Stabilization Act to restore liquidity and stability to the financial system of the United States. In the ensuing months, we witnessed a collapse in stock market prices, with the Dow Jones Industrial Average declining by 54% between October 2007 and March 2009. National unemployment rising from 4.8% early in 2008 to 9.8% in September 2009. Debt markets effectively shutting down for several months. In an atmosphere characterized by Federal Reserve President Ben Bernanke as having elements of a classic panic, something which he knew a lot about, having studied it in his thesis. And revelation of the largest securities fraud in history, with Bernard Madoff now estimated to have misappropriated some $64 billion. Our panel today will focus on understanding what happened and how we can avoid future recurrences of this kind of financial emergency. Little questions. most serious and important questions. What is the role of regulation? What are the essential market failures that justify intervention when there would be consensual trade? When is government takeover justified? And what of the moral hazard associated with too big to fail? John Maynard Keynes wrote that, and I quote, "Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist." We will all be much affected by the thinking that emerges from the recent crisis. I will call upon our speakers in alphabetical order. First, Richard Breeden. Richard Breeden is a past chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission and current chair of Breeden Capital Management. He is a graduate of Stanford and Harvard Law School. He is among the most respected advisors to large corporations, both in the United States and abroad. Richard.
Well, thank you very much. Since I am the first of today's panelists, I'll fiddle with this microphone more than others, perhaps. Let me thank the University and President Seligman for putting on this entire day and for inviting all of us as panelists to participate. Whether or not financial regulation is the most critical topic of the 21st century, I leave to others to judge. My wife characterizes it as one of the 3 most boring topics on earth. But perhaps because I have subjected her to discussions of that for more years than I would like to admit. I also want to start by just saying what a great pleasure, in addition to participating in this program, it is for me to participate on a panel with Chairman Mary Shapiro. Mary and I served together at the SEC in what was one of the great experiences of my life. She was a commissioner during that time, and some SECs have controversy and conflict and disagreement. Ours was one of remarkable consensus. I think we made all our decisions as a group, and the talent and energy that Mary brought to the SEC now, it is just such a source of pride to me to see it now as she is chairman of the SEC. And I can't tell you, and I hope all of you out there are investors, how fortunate we all are in investment markets to have Mary serving as chairman. I also would be remiss if I didn't note what a pleasure it is to also share a podium with my longtime friend, Gerald Corrigan. Jerry and I first met each other when I was 32 years of age. I was assigned on behalf of then Vice President George Bush to study the financial regulatory system and the giant bowl of spaghetti that the government calls financial regulation. And then Fed Chairman Paul Volcker thought I needed a crash course in understanding the system, and my tutor was Gerald Corrigan. And I have benefited from it then and have benefited from it ever since. So it's a great pleasure. Edward R. Murrow once said, if you're not confused, you don't understand what is going on. So if some of you are confused now and perhaps confused by the end of our discussion, that's a good sign. It proves that you may have an understanding of what's going on in our financial markets. I should make the disclaimer that the rest of what I'm going to say is really not as an ex-regulator or an ex-government, a person from government, but as an investor. That's what I have been doing the last quite a few years. And so I think it's useful to look at some of these perspectives, not from the perspective of regulators or regulatees, but from the investment and capital markets, which are so critical to our economic health. And in that note, I would have a little footnote to all the discussions about financial regulation, and that is that it's critical that we always remember that the purpose of the financial system in the United States is to serve the interests of the American public, not the other way around. And sometimes things that we talk about that are good or not good for financial institutions, we get adrift when we don't remember that our focus is delivering credit and capital to businesses across this country to enable them to grow, increase employment, produce economic vitality that will lead to people able to endow universities and take care of their families and do all the other things that we need to do. The period 1993 to 2007, 2008 was one of extraordinary expansion of credit, a general period of economic prosperity, a boom time in the economy, one we're not likely to see conditions like that for a while, I suspect. It led to tremendous growth in the aggregate outstanding volumes of credit. If you look back the last 100 years, credit to GDP of about 150% is more or less the normal range. In 1929, just before the crash, it was around 260 to 275%. And in 2007, as we entered the dying days of the subprime mortgage crisis, it peaked at a little over 300%. That vast sea of credit and the leverage it induced on the balance sheets of corporations, of families, of financial institutions is one of the principal drivers behind the events we saw and the need to take stock and do a better job in the future. We saw during the boom time a willingness to take risks on the part of investors and on the part of financial institutions at an historic high, and leverage was nearly everywhere. It's important in investment markets to remember that leverage does erode the margin for error of any institution, be it a company or a family. I used to describe it as high levels of leverage represent standing closer and closer to the edge of a cliff. And given that we can never predict the future, given that probability is not a substitute for the real world and the unexpected always will happen, leverage is a very toxic factor in financial market stability. Up to a point, it is healthy, and beyond a point, it erodes our margin for error to a point that that we don't have an ability to recover. It is also worth remembering that leverage in investment markets does not improve investments. It simply magnifies gains and losses. And so much of what was going on, I certainly see it in the hedge fund world, where people take investment positions and then try and pile as much leverage as possible on top of that so that a $1 gain becomes a $10 gain. Unfortunately, it works the same way in reverse and can equally magnify losses as well as gains. Leverage doesn't increase the probability of achieving gains, but it does increase the damage from falling short in our management and our expectations of activity. So it's probably something that has the widest agreement of any topic that leverage needs to be controlled, and yet it's one of the most persistently difficult things for governments and boards of directors and individual companies in a competitive market to do. If we don't find a solution to the leverage problem, we will indeed be vulnerable to seeing situations like this happen again. I want to quickly mention the context of financial reforms. I think we need to see, if we want to pursue a better economic future, we need as goals to be, and any program we come up with ideally ought to fit in this structure, we have to de-lever our economy at every level, individuals, families, corporations, non-government entities across the board, and that goes for the federal government as well. while extraordinary events were taken that have ballooned the federal level of leverage and debt, that is going to have to be unwound at some point. I know at H&R Block, where I'm chairman of the board, we took over in 2007 in the midst of the early stage of the subprime meltdown. We spent the next year paying off 80% of the company's debt. And it's really remarkable how much better life looks when you can shed the mountain of debt that many companies find themselves burdened with. Anyway, delevering is a critical thing. Second, we have to replace the capital that has been destroyed in the market meltdown, and it's a prodigious number. That can only happen not by borrowing more money, but by sustainable increases in profits on the part of businesses across the world, around the world. Third, I think it's critical that we restore America's industrial base, an economy predicated entirely on financial or any other form of services without balance to agriculture, manufacturing, services is going to have repeated problems. And I think we have stood back too long and allowed our industrial base to erode. I serve on the board and invest in manufacturing companies, and this is a critical part of America's history we are ignoring every day. Fourth, we need to create the conditions for long-term economic growth, for stable growth, not up and then down, and that requires low taxes, as low as possible, and we're all going to be paying a little more taxes in the future to help pay for what we've just been through. But long run, no economy can prosper by having steadily increasing levels of tax in the aggregate. Two, we have to do everything possible to create the best educational system in the world. We like to talk about it, we like to say it, and we achieve it in certain institutions, including this one, but not across the board and to the extent we need to, and our economy will never be adequately prosperous if we don't fix education. And third, as a condition of economic growth, we have to constrain the role of government to reasonable boundaries. Government can't lead us to prosperity. We have to lead ourselves to it, with government playing a role preventing abuse and excess and facilitating, but it can't be the leader. And last, I think we need to, but I leave it to our luncheon speaker to do something to fix our energy independence. I'm going to wind up on the topic of too big to fail, because I know all our other panelists will cover other parts of this. It's a topic I grappled with when I was in Washington when confronting the failure of Drexel Burnham Lambert, which was allowed to fail without government intervention or subsidy, and the market did just fine. That happened not in an era of systemic crisis that in the last we saw in the last go-round, so I'm not using that as an example to prove that one should never intervene, just simply one I had personal experience with. And also, it was my job as a young White House aide to try and figure out a solution to the last American banking crisis, the savings and loan crisis. Our formula there was never to provide bailouts, but to offer extremely fast funerals. Institutions that have failed need to be gotten out of the marketplace. Their directors need to leave their positions. Their management needs to go get another job somewhere. They need to get out of the way of healthy institutions who are the ones who should be in the market. And propping up failures is a counterproductive activity. And as much as one can, government should avoid that. Having said that, it would be, I think, lacking in candor for anyone who has ever looked over the abyss in dealing with enormous institutions on the ropes and in danger of failure to say that too big to fail should never happen. One must remember every time one considers it that bailouts create moral hazard, they create the seeds for future bailouts and future failures, they create taxpayer costs, they create capricious windfalls for people who don't deserve them. They are generally a bad thing, a really bad thing. They're not something we should sit around hoping and planning and looking forward to conducting. But occasionally they are also necessary. And that is because the stability of the banking system is critical to the economy. It's like the electrical grid, and we all take great comfort in knowing that when you flip the switch, the lights will come on. And so, too, the economy relies on a banking system that functions smoothly to deliver credit and allow transactions to be processed. Therefore, in my view, the government's actions to prop up Citicorp and B of A, both of which were clearly insolvent and clearly had failed economically, was the right thing to do, because I think the system would not have absorbed failures of those institutions. And at the core of the banking system, the government was right to intervene. I think it also made the right call to let Wachovia and WAMU fail by pushing them into other institutions. But I would draw the line personally at the banking system and argue that no non-bank or non-bank holding company is too big to fail. And I don't care whether you want to list General Electric or Google or General Motors or whoever, Facebook or whoever is really most critical to you individually or us as an economy. I think if the banking system is strong enough, we can afford to let individual borrowers, individual companies who are participating in capital markets go through reorganization in bankruptcy and come out hopefully with a new set of owners and a new balance sheet at the other end. So my shorthand is that Citicorp, B of A, and Lehman Brothers were the right decisions. Bailing out Bear Stearns implicitly was the wrong decision, and certainly wrong to do it with AIG. That's just to get our panel started off with a few specifics that maybe will engender some discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I think that will engender some discussion. Gerald Corrigan is past president and chief executive officer of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and a current managing director of Goldman Sachs, where he serves in the office of the chairman. He was also president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis and is married to my colleague, Trustee Kathy Minahan, who is president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. Nobody is more knowledgeable about the Federal Reserve System. We learned also that he was Richard Breeden's teacher, so that's another credit. Jerry is an economics PhD from Fordham. Jerry.
Thank you, Hugo, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Hugo, I feel compelled to mention that I suspect that in the history of mankind, there probably will never again be a couple that can claim presidencies of 3 of the 12 Federal Reserve banks, but Kathy and I can do that. Now, what I want to do here this afternoon is very briefly share with the audience several points of what I call basics of finance, all of which relate directly to this larger question of how, in the wake of the crisis, we should go about the reform and restructuring of the banking and financial system. And as I see it, the core objective of this exercise of reform should be one in which what we are seeking to do is to create an environment for the future in which the probabilities of financial crises are lower and our capacity to limit the damage of future financial crises when, not if, but when they occur, are greater. So we want to take the probabilities down and we want to take damage control up. To me, that is fundamentally what this exercise is all about. Now, I do have a text of my remarks, which will be available both on the Goldman Sachs website and I understand at the University of Rochester's website as well. So I am going to try to take some shortcuts, Hugo, so I can stay strictly within your 15-minute rationing of time. But the first of these basics of finance has to do with how we think about the capitalization and the liquidity of major financial institutions. And as all of you know, capital, of course, is the cushion to guard against losses, and liquidity is the amount of cash or near cash you can have at an institution. So if there are problems and people want to get their money out, you've got the wherewithal to be able to do that. Now, it is a foregone conclusion, and Mary Shapiro told me she just got back from Basel, Switzerland, so she can speak to this with great authority, but it is a foregone conclusion that financial institutions worldwide are facing the certainty of substantially higher capital ratios. That is baked in the cake, and it should be. However, when I look at the crisis, certainly in retrospect, and Richard, particularly some of the cases that you mentioned, Lehman, AIG, Bear Stearns, et cetera, one of the things that is absolutely crystal clear is that we can no longer afford to look at capital independently of liquidity, both from a managerial point of view and from a regulatory point of view. These two things going forward have to be looked at as a single integrated discipline, not an either-or. And I should emphasize that making that transition, both intellectually and pragmatically, is not going to be the easiest thing in the world, but it is the first of the basics of finance going forward that I think has to change. The second subject that I cover is risk monitoring and risk management, both by supervisors and by financial institutions themselves. And I have, for many, many years, believed that there is a very basic distinction between risk monitoring on the one hand and risk management on the other. And specifically, risk monitoring has to do with the question of getting the right information to the right people at the right time, whereas risk management has to do with what you do with that information once you have it. But it seems to me unambiguous that even casual observation of the events of the past 2 years suggests powerfully to me that there were substantial failures in risk management, yes, but perhaps in some ways, more importantly, there were substantial failures in risk monitoring. And again, it's for me a matter of common sense. If you don't have the right information, your risk management systems simply are not going to be up to the task. Now, to give you one specific example of a feature of risk monitoring that I feel very strongly about, and it is the proposition, in my judgment, that all large integrated financial intermediaries, not just in the United States, but around the world, should have or be developing the capacity such that within a matter of hours, those individual institutions can put together comprehensive exposure information for any counterparty, any place in the world, across all offices, all geographies, and all products. Now, right now, my hunch is that for the industry as a whole, we have some work to do to get to that standard. But to me, it is one of the best and easiest illustrations of what I mean when I talk about the importance and effectiveness of risk monitoring as distinct from risk management. Another subject that I touch on in these remarks, which I'm going to largely skip over because it's so technical, but I want to mention it nonetheless. And it is what I like to call financial infrastructure weaknesses. Now, financial infrastructure is the plumbing, if you will, of the financial system, which almost all of us tend to take for granted until something goes wrong. But again, if we look at the experience of the past 2 years in particular, time and time again, the importance of the reliability, the integrity, and the security of the plumbing of the financial system became obvious, sometimes in ways that weren't so good. And I have long advocated this area as a matter of particular emphasis. As I said, I'm not going to go into the details except to make the following observation. That if, as Richard suggested, we want to get to the point where we have a much better prospect of dealing with too big to fail, one of the things that's going to happen is we're going to have to substantially enhance the capacity of the official community working with the private sector to be able to wind down large institutions. And trust me, wind downs are very, very difficult to execute. But I do think that collectively we now have a pretty good idea of the things that we have to do to strengthen the infrastructure that will make it at least easier to execute wind downs when the need arises. The next point I want to mention briefly is a feature of the structure of the financial system, which I think is often overlooked. Here in the United States in particular, we have a financial system which relies on a dual system of financial intermediation, in which part of the intermediation process takes place through banking institutions. This is the classic historical institutional intermediation. But in the United States, side by side with the system of institutional intermediation, we have a system of market intermediation, and in particular, capital market intermediation. That trait, dual trait of the financial system is probably more richly developed in the United States than just about any other country, with the possible exception of the UK. And I think it's a great strength for the system, and I think it's a great source of stability, both in the past and in the future. One very important outgrowth of that dual system of intermediation is the fact that in the United States and around the world, there are a relatively small number of institutions that play the role of market makers. And as market makers, they commit their own capital to making markets and everything from treasury bills to OTC derivatives. I think that that feature of the system, the market maker, is central to both price discovery and efficiency, and I think we've got to preserve it. But as we preserve it, we've got to put greater emphasis to be sure that it is well managed and, above all, well capitalized. The other point I want to touch on briefly is what I like to call the philosophy of prudential supervision. Now, here I feel, again, quite strongly that what we need is to continue to shift the philosophy of prudential supervision toward greater emphasis on a principles-based approach which focuses relatively more attention on case-by-case judgment and relatively less emphasis on mechanical rules and formulas. But we need to remember we need some of both. For example, the enormously complex rules for governing the arithmetic of calculating official capital requirements are necessary. You've got to have rules to do that. But on the other hand, making judgments about the adequacy of capital on the part of managers and supervisors is by its nature much, much more an art than it is a science. And it seems to me that that distinction we've got to work on. I should also note, though, that there is some encouraging evidence of a shift in the right direction over time. The last point I will mention, and I think I have 3 minutes by this clock, 2, is the fiscal legacy of the financial crisis. And again, let me just put this in stark terms for you. We are looking at today and for the foreseeable future budgetary deficits that are at the very outer edge of our experience in our entire national history. But what in some ways is even more troubling is that federal government spending as a percentage of GDP today is running about 27%. And historically, that ratio has been about 20% with some small ups and downs. And it seems to me very obvious that getting the rate of spending materially back toward the 20% historical norm is not going to be easy. And indeed, it seems to me that it raises the very fundamental question in a democratic society of what role do we want the government to play in our affairs as a nation. It's not clear to me how we're going to answer that question, but I do think that we should all be mindful of the fact that we've got to get these spending rates and deficits down. It's not going to be easy, but to the extent we do not succeed in doing it over time, the mere fact of that legacy of our fiscal affairs could easily sow the seeds of the next crisis some years down the road. Now, let me stop there, Hugo. I think I just about made it.
Thank you, Jerry. Such power. Mary Shapiro is the current chair of the Securities and Exchange Commission, past chief executive officer of the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, and past chair of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. She is at the center of the debate about financial regulation going forward. Mary Shapiro has a law degree from George Washington University. Mary.
Thank you, Hugo. It's a great pleasure for me to be here at the University of Rochester and to participate on a panel with such distinguished members. And I have to say, most especially with Richard Breeden. Richard led the SEC as chairman at a time when the agency was unabashedly and widely considered to be the real jewel of the federal government. And that was really in no small part due to his leadership, his vision, his decisiveness, and as you heard from his remarks, his ability to look at a problem and distill it right down to its essence so that the answers for how to solve that problem seem so clear. I also want to thank Joel Seligman, a longtime friend and colleague, for the opportunity to be included today. It's really quite an honor for me. So as Hugo outlined for us, we have been coming through in the last several months the worst financial crisis in half a century in our country. And the repercussions have really been felt very broadly throughout American society, but also around the world. And I think most importantly for regulators and for our discussion today, the crisis really has laid bare the limitations that exist in our financial regulatory structure and exposed gaps in regulation of products and market participants that truly must be filled. I do think that in the coming months, Congress will enact new legislation regarding the way we regulate our financial markets, and I believe this is so because there is such an overwhelming need for reform. The shape of that regulation and legislation is still subject to the rough and tumble of Washington, of course. But I think that many of the legislative proposals that are working their way through Congress, though perhaps not perfect, do represent a significant step forward. And as chairman of the SEC, I'm really personally committed to helping turn the hope of regulatory reform into a reality. What I thought I'd do this afternoon is take a few moments to lay out briefly the gaps that I think need to be addressed. Second, the most constructive way I believe we can approach the issues of systemic risk as regulators. And third, the steps that we're taking at the SEC, apart from the legislative process, to achieve reform. I think that of all the various gaps that need to be addressed, a top priority must be the regulation of over-the-counter derivatives. And there are many culprits, obviously, in the near collapse of our financial system. But products like derivatives played a significant role in facilitating unregulated shadow markets. They caused hidden counterparty exposures that led to significant market risk and really, ultimately, the unprecedented government intervention. Notwithstanding all of that, these products have been left excluded from regulation due to a law that was passed in 2000, the Commodity Futures Modernization Act, which specifically prohibited the regulation by either the SEC or the CFTC of credit default swaps and other OTC derivatives. I think it's really critical that we bring greater transparency and oversight to the OTC derivatives markets by both regulating the products and the professionals who deal with them. Because right now, the gap in over-the-counter derivatives market creates opportunities for regulatory arbitrage, which really facilitates the flow of capital from regulated markets to unregulated markets. And once in the dark, unregulated arena, there are many fewer checks available to market participants and to regulators. And that's why the administration, the Congress, the CFTC chairman, and I have all sought to bring this area under the regulatory umbrella so that we can both improve transparency, but also through rigorous regulation of swap dealers and facilitating central counterparties, we can significantly reduce the kind of bilateral counterparty risk that threatens so many institutions and caused the demise of several in the last year. So next week, the House Financial Services Committee will actually begin marking up the legislation that goes right to the heart of this issue. I think another area where we need to fill gaps is with respect to hedge funds, and they have flown under the regulatory radar for far too long. We don't even have today a comprehensive database of basic census information about who these hedge funds are and who their managers are. And as a result, it's virtually impossible to monitor their activities for either systemic risk or investor protection purposes. So I do strongly support the administration's proposal to require investment advisors to hedge funds to come under the regulatory umbrella to register with the SEC as investment advisors so we at least have a handle on their activities. And finally, in the area of gap filling are the administration's efforts to harmonize the standard of conduct that applies to broker-dealers and investment advisors. Today, when an investor visits a financial consultant for advice, they don't think about whether that professional is a broker or an investment advisor. And yet, the duty of care that that individual investor is owed by that professional varies rather differently. And the rules that apply are quite different depending upon whether they call themselves a broker or they call themselves an investment advisor. So I strongly support the approach of creating a single standard, namely a strong fiduciary standard of conduct, so that any investor who's seeking investment advice will know that the professional sitting across the desk or on the other end of the telephone is someone who will put the investor's interests before their own. That being said, the fiduciary standard of care is important, but it's not enough. It doesn't eliminate fraudsters who prey upon unsuspecting investors. And so to be effective for the protection of investors, a fiduciary standard has to be coupled with effective regulatory program for both brokers and investment advisors. And so the administration has made this a centerpiece of its investor protection legislation. I believe that by filling these gaps, among others, and of course using our existing authorities, we can help minimize systemic risks, which is the next area I really want to touch upon. In today's world, markets are so fast and interconnected, and traditional regulations so siloed with particular regulated entities, we do need a regulator who's looking across markets to identify and minimize systemic risks. And there's been lots of discussion in Washington and really around the country about a systemic risk regulator and the creation of one. I think it's important that we have an entity doing that, but I also think that in addition to vesting an individual agency with responsibility for systemic risk regulation, we also need a strong and diverse oversight council of regulators. Under this kind of a hybrid approach, an oversight council could be responsible for identifying risks across the system, setting standards for key elements such as liquidity and capital, and helping to ensure that future regulatory gaps and those arbitrage opportunities are minimized or avoided. On the other hand, the individual systemic risk regulator, say the Federal Reserve, working with the primary regulators, would then be responsible for ensuring that these standards are implemented. I think this approach gives us the best structure to ensure clear accountability, to enable a strong, nimble response when it's needed, and to maintain the broad and differing perspectives that are needed to identify risks and minimize unintended consequences. To be effective, I think a systemic risk regulator should, among other things, have access to information across the financial markets, serve as a second set of eyes upon those institutions whose failure really can put the system at risk, have ready access to information about institutions that might pose a risk to the system, including holding company liquidity and risk exposures, monitor whether institutions are maintaining capital levels that are required by the council, and have clear delegated authority to respond quickly in extraordinary circumstances. The reason I favor this hybrid approach is because I think it does minimize systemic risk in a couple of different ways. First, the council ensures different perspectives to help identify risks that an individual regulator might miss or consider too small to warrant their consideration. Secondly, the financial regulators on the council would have experience regulating different types of institutions, including smaller institutions. So the council would be more likely to ensure that risk-based capital and leverage requirements do not unintentionally foster greater systemic risk. For example, by giving large, systemically important institutions a competitive advantage over smaller institutions that would permit those large ones to grow even larger and take on even more risk. And I think thirdly, the council would include multiple agencies like the SEC, the CFTC, the FDIC, and others, thereby significantly reducing the potential for conflicts of interest on the part of the systemic risk regulator. Of course, the most potent weapon against systemic risk is tough regulation by the primary or prudential regulators. But a single systemic risk regulator, together with a council, will help to serve as a protective backstop that can identify systemic risk, significant risk, and hopefully address it before we approach another meltdown. And then finally, I think every regulator, including the SEC, has to take steps to look at what they can do short of legislation within their current areas of responsibility to restore resiliency to the regulatory system. I will tell you that at the SEC, we're particularly motivated to reform our procedures as a result of the revelation of the Madoff fraud. When I got to the agency about 9 months ago, that fraud had just come to light. I think Madoff had been arrested about 2 months before, and our agency inspector general had already begun his investigation. But rather than waiting for his report, we identified a number of areas that I believed we could could be improved immediately, and so we began the reform process. As a result, for example, we've been revitalizing our enforcement division, which under its new director, a highly accomplished former federal prosecutor and Rochester graduate, is creating specialized units that can target particular types of fraud and misconduct and have specific and in-depth know-how to bring very complex cases much more quickly. We've also removed procedural hurdles to the staff's investigative and litigation practices, and we've done something that's hard to do in government. We've eliminated an entire layer of management to put more investigators and attorneys right on the front lines of bringing cases. We've also been working to revamp the way we handle the over 1 million tips that we receive every year through changes in our business processes and our technology. We've been bringing on new skill sets. The SEC fell behind in keeping up with Wall Street. And we've been improving our risk-based techniques so that we're focusing our resources on high-risk targets. We created the first new division in 15 years, the Division of Risk, Strategy, and Financial Innovation, and we're populating it with experts from the derivatives, hedge funds, and financial analysis fields. We've also proposed new rules that will better protect and ensure the safe custody of client assets that are held by investment advisors. And we've been bolstering our examinations unit, which, like the enforcement group, will undergo a very, very thorough assessment and reorganization. But in addition to all those internal reforms that are very much driven by the Madoff fraud, we've also been engaged in a very active agenda to change the rules that govern the markets, also which arise out of the financial crisis. So we've proposed rules and adopted some that we hope will address abusive short selling in the marketplace. We've adopted rules that would require credit rating agencies to reveal to the public the performance of their track records. And we've proposed other rules that would inhibit the practice of ratings shopping. We've proposed rules that would put a greater onus on brokers who trade municipal security in a large retail market to ensure that information about those securities is more available to the public. And in particular response to the financial crisis and the corrupting influence of excessive compensation packages, we've proposed to facilitate shareholders' ability to nominate directors to the boards of the corporations that they own. We've proposed a number of rules in the market structure area, including to ban flash orders, which give select few in the marketplace an advantage over others. And we've proposed significantly strengthening the standards governing money market funds coming out of the advent last September of the reserve primary fund breaking the buck, causing a run on money market funds and forcing the Treasury in the position of creating a money market fund guarantee program. So our rules should help prevent a similar occurrence. Those are just the tip of the iceberg, but I think these initiatives help to demonstrate that reform, while it's terribly important we get it done legislatively, it's also important that within every individual agency we work very hard to do what we can within the current limits of our authority. Thank you.
It was so specific and generous and really just wonderful. Richard Thaler is the Ralph and Dorothy Keller Distinguished Service Professor of Economics and Behavioral Science at the University of Chicago. So he's my colleague. I'm certain that he is eager for me to flog his bestseller, Nudge, written with Cass Sunstein. So I'm doing that. Cass was just confirmed as an advisor to President Obama. Less well known, Richard has just been announced as an advisor on regulatory issues to the Conservative Party in England. Go figure. Richard's PhD is from the University of Rochester, where he studied with Sherwin Rosen. Richard Rosette wrote a really path-breaking thesis, which did not at all suggest what he'd be up to eventually. Richard.
Thank you, Hugo. It's a great pleasure to be back here. Actually, Hugo and I were talking about that thesis on the plane coming out here from Chicago. And there's an interesting story about that relates to the comments I'm going to make. My thesis was about the value of a human life, not any particular life, but the value of a statistical life. So how much should government be willing to pay to make things safer, like roads and airplanes and so forth? And the way I addressed the problem was to figure out how much you had to pay people to get them to take risky jobs. Now, The only thing that made that thesis possible was my father was an actuary, and he actually got me data from the Society of Actuaries on death rates by occupation. And I was able to match that up with wage data, and Sherwin and I ended up writing a paper based on that. Now, here's the interesting fact that I'll relate this all to. This week, OSHA announced that for the first time, they will publicize and put up on the web fatality rates by occupation. So not only will somebody be able to update my thesis, but it's an example of a commitment to transparency that the Obama administration, there was an executive order about this on January 21st, a commitment toward transparency, and that, you'll see that's a theme I will come back to. Now, those of you who were at Malcolm Gladwell's wonderful talk last night, no, he talked about one behavioral cause of the crisis. I'm what's called a behavioral economist, which means I take the findings of psychology and apply it to economic problems. So Malcolm talked about overconfidence as one of the causes of the crisis, which it undoubtedly was. Let me mention a few others. So another one I would point to is complexity. The world has just gotten more complicated. If you go back to the movie It's a Wonderful Life that we all watch at Christmas time, it depicts the banking world of 70 years ago, or whenever that was, and it was a banker making loans to people he knew. Now, the world is not like that anymore. We have mortgage brokers making loans to people they don't know based on income they make up. And then the mortgages are packaged and sold in securities that are sold over the counter. Now, this is a world that is much harder to understand. Economic theory, unfortunately, makes no distinction between hard problems and easy problems. Traditional economics assumes that people are smart and that they are just as good at hard problems as easy problems. Real people find chess more difficult than tic-tac-toe and would find the current economic world more difficult than the one 60 years ago. We need to take account of that. A second problem that behavioral economists stress is self-control. Traditional economists assume that people have no self-control problems. So no one is fat, no one ever hungover, and people save for retirement. Instead, Americans are obese, frequently hungover, and for most of this decade, the personal saving rate was zero. So this is a failure of self-control, and we had a failure of self-control at all levels of the financial system. Another problem that traditional economics doesn't address is the role of social influence. We're affected by what our neighbors do. We're affected by fashion. Economists themselves are not very fashionable, and so they assume others are immune to fashion. But I don't mean that as a personal slight, Hugo. And finally, I'll talk a bit about incentives, which regular economists and behavioral economists agree were at the heart of this problem. Now, I think there's one interesting point, and it goes, which is this is a crisis that was caused by mistakes, by cognitive errors from the very top to the very bottom of the food chain. So the crisis started with subprime loans, and I think it's fair to say that many of the people who took out those loans didn't understand them. Now, of course, some were gaming the system, but others were just befuddled and or were subject to fast-talking mortgage brokers. And that's not very surprising to anyone. If you have unsophisticated borrowers that meet up with tricky door-to-door salesmen, disaster is likely to strike. I think what's a little more surprising is that we saw the same kinds of problems at the very top of financial organizations. I think it's fair to say that many of the organizations that failed, whether they were bailed out or not, that the CEOs and boards of those companies did not understand the risks that some of their employees were taking. And in part, that's because the world had gotten so complicated that no CEO was capable of understanding all the features that were going on. Now, what are the solutions? I think one temptation is to call for top-down control, heavy-handed regulation. We need the government running the banks. I think anyone who knows anything about this business knows that that's folly. Let me give you one anecdote that got repeated. I was in Washington in January giving a speech to the Treasury Executive Institute or something like that. It's the career Treasury employees, and I asked them who there was ready to take over running Citibank. And I gave a similar speech in London to a similar group and asked who was ready to take over running Royal Bank of Scotland. And in neither place did any hands go up. So we simply don't have people working for government for, I can tell you what Mary's salary is, and because it's the same as everyone else's, and it's less than what a new assistant professor in finance gets. So we don't have people ready to run major financial institutions ready in Washington to take over. We have to do something else. So what would I stress? Number one would be transparency. And this goes back to the story of my thesis. I think we need better data in machine-readable form. This is something that Cass and I stress in, what was the name of that book you mentioned, Hugo? Nudge, right. Nudge. Cass has a new baby, by the way, and he has that same crummy salary that Mary does. So it's important you all buy at least 10 copies of that book. So Cass, I give all the royalties to Cass. So transparency. Now, here's an interesting thing about this. I believe, well, I know a company that provides data on 401k plans for companies. They do this. They've recently been able to expand their business because the government released data that had been locked up in the Labor Department until January. And now they're able to publicize this data for everybody. Now, this allows employees to make good judgments about where to work, but I think more than one CEO is going to look at their ratings and say, geez, we have a lousy 401k plan. I didn't know that. So I think better transparency will be revealing to the market and to senior management who have no idea what's going on in their own companies. As for too big to fail, I think we must agree on whether we can debate about which companies should be bailed out. I think we'd all agree that it should happen as infrequently as possible. Here's a rule of thumb I would offer. Too big to fail means too big to hide. So there has to be a cost to being too big to fail because you're getting a free insurance policy from the government. And I think one of those taxes that they should have to pay is they should have to reveal more about what they're doing. I think I'm out of time, I'm doing fine. Okay, no, that's good. You want to hear more about my thesis? No. I'm gonna end early so that we have time for Q&A. As far as incentives go, I think that it's a mistake for us to think that government should be setting pay scales. There are lots of people, including some professors, who get paid more than they deserve, and many pop stars and football players, and especially baseball players. But I don't think that we want the government deciding what A-Rod's salary ought to be. And I don't think we want them to decide what CEO's salary should be either. I do think it's perfectly reasonable for the government to take an interest in the structure of compensation. So, for example, I personally would favor rules that say anybody in the financial sector that's getting paid more than X, you fill in what X is, say $2 million, that a substantial portion of that needs to be in deferred compensation and with clawback. And the structure we had was you could get very rich as long as you were making money, and then when you stop making money, walk away. Now, there are some young people in the audience. If you want to get rich, here's a strategy I'm suggesting. Don't quote me on this. Go into the market of selling earthquake insurance. Now, you want to set your company up in some Caribbean island that does not have an extradition treaty, and sell this insurance in California for half the market price. And your plan is to just collect premiums until there's an earthquake and then go off to your villa and hide. Now, that sounds preposterous, but that's very much like selling credit default swaps. You sell credit default swaps until they default, and then, oops. So we need a structure. We need a structure where guys can't make $10 million a year until the rare event that they're insuring occurs, and then they go off and do something else. So I think that's what I would say about incentives. The last comment I'll make picks up on something Steve Chu said in his remarks earlier, where they, at Bell Labs in their glory days when they were churning out inventions and patents and Nobel Prizes at a fast rate, one of the secrets he pointed to was that they had scientists as managers. The financial firms that have been most successful, including Goldman Sachs, I would point out, are people who have had experienced traders as managers. They're capable of understanding what the traders are doing and are less likely to get fooled by a Nick Leeson. And we've had so many, Nick Leeson, if you don't remember, was the guy who single-handedly took down Barings Bank, one of the biggest banks in the world, because of a rogue trading, and we had exactly a replication of this at a French bank recently. So it's a good bet that the head of Barings didn't know what Nick Leeson was doing. It's a good bet that the head of Société Générale didn't know what that trader was doing. If we have people running trading divisions who used to be traders, they're less likely to be fooled. Okay, thank you very much.
working. So I thought we might have a short discussion among us and then turn to the audience for questions, and there'll be mics in the aisles. But I was really intrigued, a little bit surprised by the let AIG fail. And I was wondering whether we could have, whether you really mean it, whether we could have a bit of a discussion about this, whether some of the remediations that we've been talking about, the transparency, Mary Shapiro specific comments about monitoring liquidity, some of these things might, have us with a better world. But first, I really want to go after you on what you would have seen, what we would have seen, and why you make the comment that you would have been willing to let it go.
Sure. Well, as I've tried to preface my remarks, I don't think bailouts are socially useful in most cases, and we really need to engineer the system to have the fewest possible. I have several reasons why I think AIG was understandable that the government did it when they did, coming immediately after Lehman, and there was a sense of a snowballing going on in the markets. So I don't mean to be critical of the individuals who made that decision, because I think it was made with all best intentions. I would have preferred to see AIG allowed to default, because the people who had, and AIG was the world's most promiscuous credit default swapper.
Yep.
So they were the streetwalker of the credit default swap world. I don't think that gives them a level of nobility that warrants having retired school teachers in Rochester paying taxes to bail out their traders. So, and to Richard's comment about the, Caribbean island and the earthquake insurance, had AIG, you had a number of people around the world, major financial institutions, who had entered into contracts with AIG to lay off risk. Perfectly sensible. They weren't buying treasury bills when they did that. They knew they weren't buying treasury bills. And so they took risk knowing that there was a possibility that AIG could default. And the government, when that possibility comes along, steps in and says, no, we will replace your credit default, non-transparent credit default swap contract with a treasury bill. That's bad economics that will induce in the future far more people to believe that a credit default swap might look like a treasury bill. And what a great thing if you can pay less for it than a treasury bill and get treasury credit. And so we will induce moral hazard at an immense level. The other reason that, and that's a bad thing. Now, Jerry or someone will say, but if AIG was allowed to fail, then that would have accelerated contagion. And that's probably right. And my answer about AIG has to be understood in the context that if AIG's failure had led Deutsche Bank to fail, because it had used AIG as such a large counterparty that when they found out that they had a claim in AIG's bankruptcy instead of a collectible swap contract, if they then failed, fine. Let policymakers decide, does Deutsche Bank have to be bailed out? And by the way, the German government could have imposed taxes on the German public to pay for that rather than. So what you had through AIG was an indirect bailout. By bailing out AIG, you benefited a host of large institutions around the world in varying degrees with no transparency. We don't know exactly who got benefited and exactly by how much. Essentially everyone in the trading world. Some of the people who got treasury bills when they bargained for a contract from a streetwalker, some of those people could have absorbed those losses without the taxpayers. Others might not have been able to, and we should know who those people are, because that's the real problem. The real problem was not AIG going down, but anybody else that had exposed themselves to AIG beyond the ability of their risk management system to cope with it.
He knows better whether Goldman would have gone, but do you think Morgan Stanley and Goldman might have gone?
No. But accepting that the data wasn't there for anybody to know, accepting also that it would undoubtedly have put pressure on the world system that would have been better to avoid. And the real answer for all this isn't having massive collapses, but is having better transparency ahead of time so we avoid it in the first
I think I have every one of you now participating. Yes.
Well, first of all, given the timing, I philosophically agree with a lot of what Richard has said. I think as a practical matter, there was no choice, given the timing. Now, I think there's also some factual questions that we got to be careful with here. Some counterparties of AIG in the credit default swap space made it their business to be fully collateralized, and others didn't. Goldman Sachs, as an example, was essentially collateralized or hedged. Others didn't. That gets back to my point earlier about risk monitoring, knowing what the hell's going on. There's another little-known fact about AIG, and this is public information, so I'm not violating any rules here. Of the money that was provided to AIG between September 16th and December 31 of 2008, and was paid out to others, there was more money, either Fed or taxpayer money, paid out for securities lending activities on the part of AIG and guaranteed investment contracts to state and local governments by a large amount that was paid out in the context of the credit default swaps. So the credit default swaps were not the only problem that AIG had by a long shot. And again, the securities lending business is, it should be a sleepy business. But when you take cash, and if you got all these insurance companies, you got lots of securities to lend out. And in the old days, you got cash and securities lending, and you bought treasury bills, and you made 12 or 15 basis points, and everybody lived happily ever after. Well, if you decide when you get that cash for lending securities, you're going to start putting in structured credit products, not everybody always lives happily ever after. So the story is quite complex. But again, I would say, again, while not disagreeing philosophically at all with Richard, at that point in time, if I'd have been there, I would have done exactly the same thing.
Mary?
On the securities lending piece, I would just say that Jerry's absolutely right. Traditionally, it was a way to squeak out a few extra basis points for state and local governments, pension funds, to lend out their securities. But the cash collateral they received in return got invested in very illiquid pools, and when push came to shove, they lost enormous amounts of money. So that's actually an area we're quite focused on at the moment. I would say on AIG, I think it's the poster child for why this market, the credit default swap market, needs regulation and transparency. And I think the key protection that could have been in place, and I think will be in place in the future, is centralized clearing of a vast majority of these contracts, so that you have a counterparty that is a clearinghouse, fully capitalized, taking the offset position to every dealer, and the positions would be fully margined or collateralized. There would be risk management practices in place. There would be full regulation of the central clearinghouse. And we didn't see problems with our securities clearance and settlement system, or even our regulated futures exchange clearance and settlement systems during the course of the economic crisis, because all those protections were in place. And I think that's why this legislation really is important, to get these into the central clearinghouse.
Very good. But let me put you back on the spot. Despite the moral hazard costs, which we all agree to going forward, what would you have done at the time?
It's hard to say what you would do. I can actually agree with both Jerry and Richard on this, because when you're actually looking into the abyss, I think were Richard's exact words, it's very hard to know what the right thing to do is at a time like this. And of course, many other things were going wrong in the markets at the same time.
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, I'm not going to second guess Ben Bernanke, who's a very smart guy and who knew more about what was going on then than I did. What I would say is, going forward, we want to prevent this from happening again. And I meant to mention that much of what I was talking about is just saying in other words what Jerry was talking about risk monitoring. And that's really what the byproduct of transparency would be. And the only moderately novel point I'm making is that it's possible that by requiring companies to report to the government, they may end up reporting to themselves.
I have a list of questions, but do one of you have a question for another one of you?
The only thing that I would add, Mary, to your comments about the systemic regulator, which this is covered in the text of my remarks. I just didn't have time to go into it. But I think that the key mission of the systemic regulator, with or without a board, the board thing is fine with me, is they've got to think contagion. They can't think about individual institutions or even individual markets. They have to be asking themselves the following question. Use August of 2007 as an example, the first stages of the crisis, when problems with so-called conduits and SIVs, these structured investment vehicles, popped up out of no place and almost overnight contaminated the asset-backed commercial paper market. That's contagion. Now, what we've got to get to the point of doing much better in the future than we have in the past, think contagion. And that, to me, is, I think, is the critical central mission of the systemic regulator.
How do you think about that in terms? I'm sorry, yes.
Add one point to that, which is there's an event that took place that almost no one outside the business knows about. In August 2007, there was a week where every quantitative manager was getting hammered. So I have an interest in a money management firm, and I happened to be there in that week. And I was getting calls from all my other academic friends who are affiliated with money managers. And it was, to give you a sense, a manager that had 50 stocks long and 50 stocks short would have a day where 40 of the 50 long stocks went down and 40 of the 50 shorts went up. This is bad. Now, their models said that the chance of this happening was, to quote Mel Brooks, once in a blue moon. And they had this happen 3 days in a row. And it didn't get a lot of press because the market was going up, down. It wasn't a particularly volatile time in the stock market. But what they all discovered that week was they only had one model. To a first approximation, all quantitative models are the same. Yep. And so then things calmed down, and but the lesson from that, the lesson from LTCM, when they discovered long-term capital management, they failed precisely because they didn't realize that all their bets were more correlated than they thought there were. Yep. Yep. The only way we're going to get a handle on this is through some of the things Mary was talking about. With hedge funds, here's the needle we have to thread, that Mary has to thread and Congress has to thread. We have to get them to reveal enough to Mary so she can detect those systematic risks without revealing so much to the market that they can no longer earn a living. That's a very tricky needle to thread, but it can be done. And it's only if we do that that we'll be able to avoid these systematic failures.
And just
to liven things up, it can't be done. and trying just, and it's fine to try. And I certainly agree with registered. By the way, we're registered with both the SEC and the folks in London. We're registered with everybody in the world. But the problem is you can give all data about every trading position exists. We live in a world where trading positions change a zillion times a day. So you can try and download real-time data to regulatory authorities. They're never going to be able to keep up with it. So rather than having the Alaska pipeline spewing out on some poor soul's desk at the SEC, we have to learn better how to come up with substitutes to assuming that the government will know what to do with this data. And that involves, first of all, we don't borrow a dime. We don't lever any of our positions. So compared to a firm that trades with 8 times leverage, I mean, there is an inherent difference. So government needs to learn to reduce this problem and focus on the people creating the greatest risk, not try and get every piece of data about every trade on the planet, because they'll never be able to cope with it.
Well, we can start by making leverage transparent.
That would be a great place to start.
Okay, we can agree on that.
Yeah, well,
Last point from the panel, and then we're going to go to the audience.
There's 2 kinds of leverage, as you know.
Yeah.
There's balance sheet leverage, which is pretty easy to measure. But then there's embedded leverage.
Right.
The embedded leverage that is deeply rooted within individual financial instruments and complex financial products. And trust me, I've spent a lot of time trying to do this, trying to get your arms around a coherent way to even think about, much less to quote, measure embedded leverage is not easy. And if you look at the crisis, there's no question that balance sheet leverage was a big part of the culprit. No question about that at all. But there is also no question that embedded leverage, and at least with the benefit of hindsight, probably was even a bigger part of the problem. So that's another job to put on our checklist.
I don't have to worry about it.
And I was going to ask about how we think about and monitor liquidity, because you brought that up.
Well, that I think is actually reasonably straightforward. There are now in place, with a lot of pressure, appropriate pressure from regulators, a family of what are called core excess liquidity ratios that are being increasingly used, certainly in the United States and around the world as well. Now, the difference between these core excess liquidity measures and, say, capital ratios is you can't really standardize them.
Right.
Because if you got a bank that has a huge deposit base compared to another institution that has a lot of borrowed money, but what you can do is you can do some fairly simple stress tests based on a concept called maximum liquidity outflow that really do, I think, provide senior managers and prudential regulators both with information that is easy to understand, and there's no excuse in the world why it can't be effectively monitored. There's just no excuse at all. Now, prior to the crisis, some of these things essentially did not exist.
Yeah.
But I think this, Mary, I hope you would agree, is an area where the catch-up ball has actually been happening pretty damn fast.
Terrific. Okay, let's turn to the audience, which I think means we have our president here, an expert.
And I First of all, I have to apologize to the panel. We have an event that's going to occur in just a few minutes, so I may be the only one able to pose a question. I feel I really should apologize to a very eager audience, but we do have a major event in a few minutes. Thank you all for participating in a discussion which has been wonderfully illuminating. Let me pose a question that has been the one that's most troubled me, certainly since the collapse of Bear Stearns, and has been one I have struggled with almost every day since then. I was stunned that we got to a point where one of the 5 largest investment banks in the country failed. We almost had the sense that we didn't see it coming, or alternatively, that the regulatory structure was incapable of monitoring, incapable of preventing this type of risk. I was more stunned that things proceeded along throughout the spring and summer of 2008 and led to systematically Lehman Brothers, Merrill Lynch, AIG, $700 billion that we initially saw voted in 2008. And again, there was a sense that the regulatory response was so slow, so sluggish, seemed so incapable of putting into effect lessons then. And I suppose to ask a question that may sound somewhat gloomy, but I think it's the hardball question that needs to be posed. And it takes off from Jerry's observation that there will be more crises in the future. Is there an essential cyclicality in our economy so that we can design new regulatory structures that for a while address the last crisis, but that over time, whether because of the incentive structure, whether because memories fade, whether because of the politics of the situation, the notion that they'll be enduring and sustainable is more remote. And I pose that question with a somewhat gloomy tone, in part because I think the world's going to get far more complex into the future. It's not just that technology is making the world more complex, but there are international dimensions to counterparties that were suggested by the immediate crisis. I think over time, as cash flows become even more global than they are now, the regulatory challenges will escalate even further. So the simple question is, should we feel any hope? Are we capable of putting into effect a regulatory structure that will, in fact, materially lessen the probability of this type of occurrence, or, to pose Jerry's alternative standard, lessen the damage when it does occur?
Mary, that's yours.
Of course.
That answer is yes, we can.
It's clear.
I don't know if we can succeed, but we certainly have to try. And I agree, memories are short, interests are entrenched, the lobbying in Washington is extraordinary. Even now, as some of memories start to fade as we get a year past some of the worst of the crisis. But I think that we have learned a lot of lessons from this crisis. A lot of changes have been made. They should lessen the impact of problems. There's certain cyclicality for sure. They've lessened. They should lessen the impact of the next crisis. But I think if regulators don't continue to learn the lessons and take them to heart, quite honestly, every single day, and approach their work every single day, thinking about what are the contagions, what are the systemic risks, what are the potential larger implications for the economy of what's happening in the financial services industry, then we're doomed to have some sort of a repeat problem not too far down the road. But I don't think any of the doom and gloom could ever argue for our not moving heaven and earth to try to put the right regulatory system into place to try to prevent the problems in the future. I think transparency will help enormously. I think significantly higher levels of capital will help. I think decreasing leverage will help. I think those will all make a difference the next time around.
I have an itchy past chair, so go for it.
Look, I think we all have to remember government is really important, and regulators, every generation of regulators will learn and will do their best. And some of the things Jerry was talking about, I agree completely with, are great innovations, great improvements. I agree with everything Mary was saying, but regulation will fail. It's guaranteed to happen. So you need to organize your life with the understanding that 1929's happened. 2007 happens. The Titanic did sink. The iceberg will be there. I mean, the unexpected, there's a first time for everything. And so the wrong lesson to draw out of this, where regulation massively failed. I mean, the subprime mortgage crisis wasn't hidden, folks. We were all borrowing money. Everybody knew about it. It was, it was there. I served on the board of a global Spanish bank. We talked for 6 years. We talked once a month in our board meetings about the housing bubble in the United States and when was the United States going to deal with it. It wasn't hidden. Regulators just didn't have the resolve to tackle it and stop it. And that 50 years from now, 80 years from now, don't know how long it'll be, but eventually the memories of the searing experience we've gone through weaken, and these things will happen again. So the critical lesson, most critical of all, is that every company and every family and every insurance plan and every fiduciary for other people's money has to understand that regulators cannot eliminate risk out of the world. And you have to take the level of risk that you are capable of absorbing and not more than that. And you have to balance missing opportunities with being conservative enough that you can absorb if things go wrong. And if all of us, people running university endowments, in every walk of life, if we don't follow that prudence, then believe me, in the future, regulation won't be enough. And the pressure that too much risk-taking puts on government will not be solvable. So I'm optimistic about all this. I think we've all learned a lesson that my grandmother knew, who used to tell me about the Great Depression and about the importance of saving, and I thought she was kind of quaint and ho, ho, ho. It turns out my grandmother knew a lot more about finance than I gave her credit for. And we've collectively around the world learned a lesson. The real danger point will come not 5 years from now, it'll come 10 or 20 years from now when we've forgotten some of this experience. But please, please, please internalize the job of evaluating risk and looking out for your company, your family, and don't think government can make it all go away.
And the mobilization of capital in this country and in the world has led to the creation of tremendous amounts of wealth. Let's not turn that off.